timekeeping, but mostly strict. So each presentation is going to be 20 minutes, and then there's going to be a 10-minute discussion and 10 minutes Q&A. Yes, so with that, we are already 3 minutes delay. Let's start. Thank you, Gernot, for being here.
Yeah. All right, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for coming. Thanks a lot for putting the paper on the program. It's joint work with Luetticke, with Tim, who is here, and with Moritz, who will be joining later, I suppose. So this paper is about war and inequality. And our measure of inequality is the share of income and wealth which goes to the top 1%, to the top percentile. And here in these panels, you see a well-known pattern, namely that inequality, according to these measures, declined during much of the 20th century, a finding which was put forward by Piketty. And Piketty also argued that it was the chaos of war which was presumably playing a role in this decline of inequality. If you look at the shaded areas, that gives you the period of the two world wars, and in the left panel you see that during these episodes the income share visibly declines. So among economic historians you have that discussion. They have amassed a large amount of data. They have performed case studies. In particular, there's this very seminal book by Walter Scheidel where he established this notion that war is indeed the great leveler. Yeah? War, in his account, is one of the four horsemen, yeah? Next to revolutions and state breakdowns and pandemics, which has brought down inequality in history. And he paints this very gloomy picture according to which you need violence to get to a more equal society. Okay? But this view is not uncontested. For instance, Waldenström in a recent book argues that there's also peaceful forces of leveling at play after World War II. So there's this intriguing debate among economic historians, and we thought to settle the issue, we need to bring in a macroeconomic perspective. Okay, and that's what we try to do in this paper. And macro perspective here for us means two things. First, we want to establish a general pattern moving beyond case studies, that is, and analyze systematically how war changes wealth and income inequality over time. And second, we offer a structural account based on a heterogeneous agent new Keynesian model. Okay? So what we do in the paper, we start with we set up a new historical data set, fairly granular data on income and wealth, and importantly, the drivers of their distribution, in particular taxation and destruction. And here we focus on advanced economies which have been war sites following earlier work which Moritz and I did with Jonathan, so that's Federle et al. Here. In terms of results, we find that war dramatically reduces income inequality. It also lowers the capital income share, and it impacts less wealth inequality. Now, if we try to understand what's going on, a first attempt shows that the decline in the capital share goes some way in accounting for the decline in inequality, income inequality, but only about half of the decline in income inequality can be accounted for by the decline of the capital share, which we see in the data. So this is where Hank comes in, and we show that Hank can fully rationalize the decline of the top income and the capital share in response to the war. Some literature which I skip, and let me talk a little bit about the sample. So we cover the last 150 years, but we zoom in on war-side economies. So these are 9 war episodes from the two world wars, from 7 countries. So 2 countries feature here twice in our list. The advantage of focus on these countries is that we can tie in more closely with the historical literature, which has analyzed this in some detail. We have also consistent data, but we also have in the paper results for a larger sample, and we discuss differences relative to our baseline, but I don't do this today. What I want to highlight here in this table is the numbers in the destruction column. These are data which we hand collected in order to get a sense of the destructive nature of the war, and you see some stark differences. For instance, France and Japan see the highest destruction. This is the percentage of the capital stock which is destroyed, physically destroyed in the war, and it's about a quarter of the capital stock. The numbers are lower for the UK when we're talking 5% or so. So there's some variation. In terms of the overall data set, you can classify 4 areas where we draw on existing data, but we also bring in new data. So there's the destruction which we measure, but we also draw on existing data on capital labor shares. For taxation, we develop a measure of tax progressivity, and we also collect data on government spending, but that's not the focus of today's talk. We draw on earlier work by Moritz in the macro history database to get inflation measures. And when it comes, importantly, to income and wealth, we rely on the time series provided by the World Inequality Database. So this is pre-tax income and wealth, and we supplement this with country-specific studies, and importantly, we also hand collect data on profits, which features prominently in our account in the end. Given these data, we estimate a very simple empirical specification. So we run some panel local projections where we take war as an exogenous shock. Of course, we understand that wars has many facets. In our baseline, we assume war is a dummy variable which takes on a value of 1 at the time when the war starts, and then we trace out the effect of war over time on some dependent variable. Y here in this equation relative to its pre-war level. And so we throw in various variables we are interested in, such as the top 1 income share. Now, this is a dummy variable, the war, the start of the war, so we lump together all sorts of wars, and we are looking at the average war and its effect on the outcome variable. We also experiment with a quantitative war shock measure where we really use the destruction to quantify the size of the shock, but not in our baseline, for which I show you results here. Okay, so in a way, this is the main result of the empirical analysis. In the left panel, you see the top 1 income share, in the right panel, the top 1 wealth share, and the top 1 income share declines by 30%. So to put this into perspective, think of the top 1 income share pre-war hovering around at about 10%. This falls by 30%, so say from 10% to 7%. So we are talking a drop of 3 percentage points, which is sizable. It's a 30% drop. For wealth share, the drop is smaller in percentage term. In absolute value, it's larger to the extent that the pre-war level of wealth owned by the top 1 is in an order of magnitude of 50 to 60%. Okay? But a general pattern, which we established through various robustness checks, is that there's a strong decline in the top 1 income share, 30%, and it's very persistent. It's less strong for the top 1 wealth share. We can also look at the top 10 shares. The pattern is the same, but effects are weaker, in particular for the top 10 wealth share. I don't show you this in the interest of time. Rather, we look at variables which could potentially explain what's going on. So here you see the response in the top marginal tax rate. It goes up to by 50%. Right panel gives you the response of prices over this 14 years after the start of the war. And we know that wars are inflationary, so the price level increases by some 100% over, say, this decade after the start of the war. Now, we're going to focus on these guys here. So in the left panel, you see the capital stock. It declines by 25%. So this is the endogenous response of the capital stock. So this may reflect both destruction, for which I showed you some numbers in the beginning, but it may also be the result of an endogenous response of, say, depressed investment, which is also happening during wars. Right panel gives you the share of capital income. So that's R times K divided by the labor share, W times L. And that falls strongly, so, on average by some 25%. And when we looked at these data, we thought, okay, how far does this get us, this decline in the capital labor share, in accounting for the decline in the top 1% income? And to understand what's going on, we put up a little accounting framework following earlier work by Mead. And so we define the share of wealth owned by the top 1 as KP over K. So that's the left term on top. So simply think of, in this simple framework, wealth is the same as capital, and KP is the capital owned by the top 1 relative to then the rest of the economy. And the same for income. That's the right term. Now, the interesting thing with income is that here we have 2 sources of income. So we have labor income, W times L, and capital income, R times K, both entering with the share which goes to the top 1%. And then we scale this with overall income. So nothing fancy here. Now we rewrite this in terms of the capital labor share, and we contemplate a scenario where the capital labor share declines by some D%, say, because of a distraction. Yeah? And see what happens to these little formulas. So in the left, you see the top 1 wealth share. It doesn't change, yeah, if we consider this capital distraction. So what's going on in this simple accounting framework? Well, think of an unequal distribution of wealth. So the rich hold most of the capital, the poor hold very little of the capital. But if you think of a proportional distraction of capital, of course the distribution of capital doesn't change. So that's what this simple formula says, okay? In the right panel, things are different because now we have these 2 sources of income, yeah? And to the extent that capital income account for the bulk of income at the top, a decline in the capital labor ratio hurts the incomes at the top very much. This is plausible, as you see here, by looking at French data. So here we the portfolio of the top 1 in the left panel relative to the total, and you see that the portfolio of the super rich is not so different from the portfolio of the rest of the economy. Now, if one asset class gets destroyed, this doesn't change inequality of wealth by accounting. It's different for income, where you see that the top 1 income portfolio is quite different from the rest of the economy. The top 1, they earn a lot of capital income. That's the green stuff here. And if we hit that, then we make income more equally distributed. How far does this take us? Well, we take our little accounting framework and compute what it predicts for the decline in top incomes. That's the red line, as a function of an exogenously given decline in the capital labor ratio. And in the data, we have seen a decline of some 26, 28%. That's the black vertical line. At this point, our accounting framework would predict us a decline in the top 1 income share by about 10%, while in the data, the decline is 30%. Upshot is, you know, this accounting exercise explains 1/3 to 1/2 of the decline in the top 1 income share. So this decline in the capital labor share is not the full story. So here is where Hank enters. And Hank has some nice and important aspects to bring to the debate. Of course, the heterogeneous agent part is essential to talk about the distribution of wealth and income. But more intriguingly, we think, is the new Keynesian features of the model. There are 2. First, there's monopolistic competition, yeah, which typically we treat as a nuisance. But here it becomes important, because it generates pure profits. That's a source of capital income next to R times K. Yeah? So these monopoly rents, and they will play a key role. Yeah? Second aspect, new Keynesian aspect, sticky prices, they give us time variation in markups, and that's also important because if you think of capital destruction, say because of a depreciation shock, which we throw into the model, assuming Cobb-Douglas, would imply that the capital labor ratio remains unchanged. It's just alpha divided by 1 minus alpha under perfect competition. Now, thanks to our, or under flexible prices, say, now thanks to our sticky prices, we have time-varying markups. That's the expression at the right bottom corner of the slide. So you have the mu, that's the markup. And these markup fluctuations, they let the capital labor income share fluctuate in response to shocks, which it wouldn't under flexible prices. So this is the new Keynesian stuff. You know, you might be tempted to say they use Hank because it's fashionable, but really Hank is kind of adding to the story here. That's what I'm trying to get across. Of course, I spare you the details of the Hank model here. This is just an overview slide of the model here. We built on Meyer, Bonn, Luetticke. Ralph, our co-author, is in charge. He's not here today, but I skipped the summary. I just highlight in the summary slide, you have the households on the left, and here you have these various sources of income, which makes this model here interesting for the issue at hand. So households get wage income, they earn interest on bonds, they earn interest on capital. That's narrowly defined capital income, R times K. But then there is this monopoly profits, which also go to the super rich in this model, and which has been in the past sometimes, you know, treated as a back of the model. But here in our analysis, it really becomes a feature, as you will see. How do we bring the model to the data? Well, we fix some parameters prior to the estimation, and then we assume that a war is 3 things. It's a destruction shock. We model this as a depreciation of the capital stock. We assume at the same time that tax progressivity goes up, and we say that there is extra inflation, which we model by a shock to the monetary policy rule, if you want. And then we estimate the parameters which characterize these shocks by matching the empirical impulse responses. And in this way, we make sure that the model tracks the evidence very well, as you see here. So in blue, that's the model against the data, which you have seen before. It's slightly differently represented, but the black dashed line is what the data told us, and I showed you this before. So in the left panel, you see the decline in the top 1 income share. It declines by 30%. That was the number which I put up in the beginning. In the right panel, you see the decline of the top 1 wealth share. It declines by some 7%, yeah, just what you saw earlier. Now, what about the driving forces? I mean, here the model is also fairly on track. Yeah? This is because we asked the model to match the evidence, admittedly, yeah? By picking the right parameters. So we get the increase in the marginal tax rate by 50%. We see the increase in prices by about 100%. Yeah? And here's our particular focus. We get the decline in the capital stock, and we get the decline in the capital labor share. Okay, given that the model then replicates these essential aspects of the paper, we can, of the data, we can ask the model, okay, what's going on? Because the model offers, after all, a structural account. And in the model, the war is 3 things. Remember what the war does in the model. It's a destruction of the capital, it's an increase in top marginal tax rates, and it's an increase in inflation. And so we decompose the response of the top 1 income and the response of the top 1 wealth according to these shocks by just looking at one aspect at a time, and you see the decline in the top 1 income is primarily due to the destruction. Taxation also plays a role, but its role changes over time, yeah, for top 1 income. The increase in taxation matters a lot to account for the decline in top 1 wealth. Okay? Inflation is less important, but this is still a little bit work in progress. We have to talk about it. Thanks. Now, here is what was new to us, yeah? Because what we can do now, well, let's call it, we introduced the profit channel here. This is the thing in Hank, remember, which was sometimes considered a nuisance, yeah? But it offers some interesting insights. In the left panel, you see just the plain vanilla impulse response of income of the top 1 in blue and of the bottom 99, so that's the rest of the economy in red. Both tank on impact, they fall by 30%, which is in line with what we have in the data. I didn't show you, but output drops by some 20 to 30% on impact. So this is just the income of the economy is falling by 30%. Everybody's hurt on impact. But then over time, the bottom 99 income recovers fairly quickly, while the top 1 income remains depressed for, say, 10 years. So what's going on? The right panel tells you what's going on, because here we see the sources of income: labor income, profit income, and capital income. Labor income and capital income move 1 for 1. This is the Cobb-Douglas structure of the model. So labor and capital income share remains constant if you don't consider profits, but we do have profits here, and they collapse persistently, and this hurts the income of the top 1 very much because their income loads so heavily on profits, okay? So this is more or less explaining why we have the top 1 income declining so much. Then you may ask, why do profits fall? Well, the model would tell you markups decline. Why do markups decline? In the model, that's because prices increase less than costs, which is essentially wages. Now, the intriguing question is that in the data? And indeed it is. Maybe I should go there, but we have the figure in the paper. So what you see there is clearly that wages increase faster and more strongly and earlier than prices do. Okay, then you may ask, okay, why do prices not catch up with wages? Well, the answer in the model is because prices are sticky, but that might not be fully satisfactory. So we had this in the earlier session A. We talked about price controls. Paul and his discussant price controls in the US. In discussing Matteo's paper. And we have that also for Japan, for instance. We found this nice quote where Japan implemented these price controls explicitly to make producers bear sacrifice to cover the rise in production costs. So that's precisely the idea which the Hank model also tells. Prices do not increase as much as costs, and therefore the top 1 incomes are hurt a lot because the underlying profits tank. Yeah? So final question is, you may ask, what's going on in the data with profits? We didn't know because there's little work on this, so we started collecting these data. Tim mostly did. And so we found indeed that profits decline a lot. Yeah? So for the countries in our sample, we construct time series around these war episodes and normalize this index for real profits to 100 in World War II in the year 1938. In World War I, it's 1930, that's 100. And then you see that profits are wiped out after the start of the war in France and Germany after a while. They also fall in Finland. In Japan, they increase first, and then they fall after 1944. So what's going on in Japan? Well, the answer is simply, Japan becomes a war site only in 1944. So this is when really Japan gets hurt by the war, and afterwards profits drop. Yeah, so the data consistently supports the story which Hank tells. Okay, so let me conclude. We find that war drastically reduces income inequality. It has smaller effects on wealth inequality. The destructive nature of the war is key, as Seidel would suggest. The capital-labor ratio falls, and in the Hank model, we are finally able to endogenize the decline in the capital share through the response of profits, and in this way we can also explain the decline in income inequality. There's a lot of things to do. This is still a work in progress. I apologize to Brigitte. I guess she will add to our list. Thanks.
Thank you. Now we'll continue with the discussion, and you have 10 minutes, please.
Thanks a lot to the organizers for inviting me to discuss this paper.
You need to speak in the microphone.
Yeah. It was a real pleasure reading it. And so let me summarize it briefly. The main question is, do wars reduce inequality by leveling in the income and wealth distribution? And the authors use data on major war sites in advanced economies with the baseline of World War I and World War II. And the novelty of the paper is that they construct a new long-run data set on the economic impact of wars and also on the profits during those wars. And they demonstrate that the top 1% income and wealth shares declines, and they identify the decline in capital, so capital destruction, as a key mechanism. And what I like especially is that they combine this empirical insight with a Hank model to capture and explain this drop, this endogenous decline in the capital to income share. And as I see it, the main contribution of the paper is that they document that wars have this leveling effect, especially due to the decline in income inequality at the top 1%, and that this is driven by a fall in firm profits. So my overall assessment is that this is an important contribution on the impact of wars on inequality, using this new data in combination with a Hank model to uncover the underlying mechanism. Now, briefly on the model, so there are households that are divided into workers that earn wages and supply labor, and there are also entrepreneurs that receive all the firm profits. And the key feature of a Hank model is that there is income and wealth inequality. And income inequality is driven by labor income shocks to workers, and there is also entrepreneurs at the top of the distribution who earn all the profits. And a key feature also to obtain the results is that there is monopolistic competition, such that firms earn profits, and there are sticky prices, such that the capital income share can fluctuate over time. So they have a couple of shocks in the model, especially capital depreciation and tax progressivity, and then we're estimated with Bayesian impulse response function matching. My first comment is, was Hitler exogenous? which is key to their identifying assumption that wars are exogenous to current economic conditions. Now, thinking of the Great Depression, where we had mass unemployment, financial instability, and deflation that potentially led to political instability. In addition, during the 30s, there were protectionist measures like policies like the Smoot-Hawley tariff with import quotas that reduced global trade and deepened the economic crisis. So, like specifically for the case of Germany, there was economic despair and also Hitler's promise of economic recovery that made him gain votes, rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party, which has also been documented in the literature. So maybe the authors could do a bit more in explaining that. My second comment is regarding the drivers of the drop in the 1% income shares. So we estimate this pan-local projection that they have Y as the dependent variable, for example, the top 1% income share. And then as exogenous regressors, we have 4 legs of the dependent variable and the regressors. And then we have the war start dummy that takes the value 1 at the onset of the war. So I was thinking maybe you could add in terms of the regressors by, for example, and this may help you to disentangle the driving forces. You could, for example, add one by one a variable, for example, the price level, and then you may see on the whether this reduces the decline in the top 1% income share, whether this is actually an important driving force to show that the price level has increased using it as a dependent variable, but this may help you to disentangle the drivers for the decline in the top income share. My third comment is regarding war bonds, so potentially going beyond the effect of capital destruction. So war bonds were widespread during those wars. So here you see, for example, an ad for Canadian war bonds, also called victory bonds or liberty bonds. And during World War II, 85% of US households were actually holding those war bonds. And I was wondering who were the holders of those bonds, also along the income and wealth distribution. So this may have also redistributive effects in terms of the winners and losers of the war afterwards. Those bonds lost value for the losers and may have benefited more winners of the war. And in addition, the returns to the war bonds eroded due to these high inflation rates in response to the, so after the war. And this has been shown, for example, in a recent paper by Gernot and co-authors. So I was wondering, could you maybe address this point, potentially also in combination with the Hank model, the relevance of war bonds along the income and wealth distribution? Now let me turn to my comments regarding the model. So we have workers and entrepreneurs, and the entrepreneurs are concentrated at the top of this distribution, and they earn all the pure rents. And then what I like is that the authors do an inequality decomposition, and they show that the decline in wealth inequality is mostly driven by a decline in capital returns. However, this stark decline in income inequality is driven by reduced firm profits, and the main mechanism is that capital destruction leads to an increase in the marginal cost, and this reduces profits and thereby the income of entrepreneurs at the top of the distribution. However, due to Bayesian impulse response function matching, I guess, this leaves rather little distance for the results, which is basically fine with me. I'm aware that it's super hard to match the very top of the distribution, and it makes sense also empirically, as we have discussed, to have entrepreneurs at the top of the distribution. However, I was wondering So are you using a sledgehammer to crack this nut that entrepreneurs' profits are reduced? And my suggestion would be to exploit the Hank model even more in the paper, and for example to focus also on the role of liquid versus illiquid assets during those wars, or like put differently, maybe nominal versus real assets, given the high inflation rates, and basically nominal assets have eroded, and real assets such as housing, if not destroyed, basically remain. So this maybe could add to your analysis. And then I was wondering about the winners and losers of those high inflation triggered by the war. So this is something that is not yet discussed in the paper. And this has implications not only for the very top of the distribution, but also for the remaining income and wealth distribution. So something I was wondering was here in terms of inflation. So while you nicely match the drop in the top 1% income share, I was thinking that the inflation response is not matched super nicely yet, and I think this would be good to also like capture this effect because especially it has redistributive effects. And something I was wondering in terms of reconciling empirics and a model, in the empirics, do you potentially also capture the post-war reconstruction phase, maybe like what is something that you see here with the second peak in inflation, and in the model, how would this be captured? Is this something that you could address? Now, to wrap up, I would like to give you some more food for thought in general. For example, the role of human capital. So there was a lot of death, unfortunately. People were in captivity, a lot of injuries and trauma. And so you document the decline in labor supply and also in the population, but what else were the consequences of this shock also to human capital? Then another thought was, should we think of wars as shocks that then return to their initial steady state? Or is a war something that is such a fundamental changer that we move to a post-war steady state, in fact? And then, can we generalize the results, given the baseline focuses on World War I and World War II? You do the extension with other wars as well. I was wondering, like, isolating more recent wars, what is the effect of capital in that dimension? Also, the capital intensity of wars themselves may have changed. So this is just something to think about, maybe. But overall, I think it's a super important contribution that, for the first time, as I think, combines this historical data with a fully specified general equilibrium Hank model to document the leveling effects of wars.
Do I respond quickly? Yeah. So thanks a lot, Brigitte. This was a very generous discussion. I can't, it was as expected. There's a lot of things we should do and maybe can do. So thanks for these suggestions. Let me just take up 2 points. So are wars exogenous? I mean, in my earlier work with Moritz and Jonathan, we have thought a lot about this, and we have also tried to put some evidence. So the Hitler example is interesting. Let me just make one argument here. So I mean, what's nice about our data is that we do have also these countries which are attacked, right? So let's consider France and Germany in World War II. So let's say that Hitler was elected because of some specific developments in inequality in Germany, and that caused Hitler and that caused the war. But then I think there is still enough random variation when it comes to these countries which then suffer from being attacked, and this is also where we have this evidence. In fact, in the paper we do have that experiment where we drop each war from the sample, so results do not hinge on Germany being in the sample. So I think in that sense we are fairly safe, and I would maintain this idea also in light of the evidence which we put together in the other paper that wars are fairly exogenous. So other interesting things, but let me just take this second point on bonds, on inflation, because I admit that we discuss it not sufficiently in the paper, and we should do more also in terms of analysis. You have this fancy poster from Canada, that's cool. But in the paper, what's currently happening, inflation doesn't do much. We have a better fit now because we put in that inflation, you didn't see that version, so it's a bit unfair, but so we put in an inflation shock, which gets inflation on track. Still, inflation doesn't do much in terms of redistributing. Why is that? Well, we are looking at the top one relative to the rest of the economy. This is a nominal bond in this model. And so inflation in principle could do something. The thing is, you have these guys at the bottom 1%, which are debtors, yeah, and they do gain. So you see some redistribution at the bottom of the distribution. It just so happens that our focus is on the top one, and there is not so much difference here when it comes to inflation exposure. Yeah, but we should discuss it in the paper and maybe even look at the bond distribution and see how it compares to the data. So thanks.
Perfect, thank you very much. And now we'll collect maybe around 3 questions to begin with. And yes, everyone has a microphone in front of you and there's a button to press.
Yeah, hi, Jan Schmitz, Deputy Chief Economist, DG Trade from the European Commission. I would like to come back to the question of human capital. I mean, here, of course, humans are destroyed, right, through war. And we know that's mainly the poor people who usually die in war. So in that sense, I think it's more relevant to look at the human capital of the high income owners, right? Because, I mean, supposedly they are earning a lot of money because of the human capital they have. And that human capital might be affected by war, right? So, you know, you need more potato growers in war not to starve than, I don't know, an academic looking at literature and these kind of things. So their human capital.
Top one. We are not in the top one. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, bad example, but you know, some other high musician, you know, things which are luxury goods or performers. Yeah. Now, as we know, human capital behaves a little bit like capital, right? So if you look at the income, it's, you know, it's always mixing a little bit, you know, this. So I was wondering whether introducing human capital in a way, you know, as a capital type of income, whether you think that would change the results from the model. Because I see that the high and low income move more or less in line, if I remember correctly, right? And human capital would create rather profits in that sense.
Okay, thank you. Let's collect a second question, perhaps. Yes.
Yeah, I have a technical question. And I liked what you said at the very end about price controls, right? But in the model, you only have sticky prices. And it was surprising that you could generate these effects lasting for so long, right? If I understood correctly, it was like for 5 or more years. So I wonder what drives that. And related to that, I guess the fact that you can't generate changes in inequality in the model without markup, changes in markups, is because you use Cobb-Douglas. But you could use CES aggregator, right, of capital and labor, and then presumably you could get the same effect. So is there any reason why you decided to do it with markups?
Okay, we would have time for a quick third question. Otherwise, I would give it back to the speaker. Okay, since I don't... sorry.
I actually have 2 non-technical questions. So one is like, on your first table, I was surprised to see that capital destruction was way higher in France than in Germany for World War II. So I just wonder how you can explain that, just out of pure curiosity. In the last thing, did I understand well that the model predicts that the taxation margin is not very big? Because there was this pure destruction effect, and I would expect the shape of the effect to be, the pure destruction is like very big at the beginning and then flattens out, and that's exactly what you don't have, which I was supposing naively that it was more taxation than pure destruction.
Thank you. So we only have 3 minutes to answer, but afterwards will also be time. Thank you.
Cool. So thanks. Yeah, let me start with the last point by Terry. So the pattern. Taxation kicks in the beginning, but the effect of destruction materializes over time. I guess the answer is mechanical. So, I mean, we feed in a destruction shock, which has an AR2 structure I didn't show you. So we allow this to develop over time. And I think that is also the mechanical answer to Dima's question about why the effect of price stickiness lasts, because the shocks are also lasting. Maybe I should show you the shocks which operate. So in that sense, even though price stickiness and the assumption we make here is not particularly fancy, we have average price durations in the usual order of magnitude, they keep on mattering because the shock is very persistent. CES versus Cobb-Douglas, yeah, to be honest, we started with the Hank and we saw it work nicely. I don't know a way to test whether our Cobb-Douglas assumption here, together with a time-varying markup, would outperform a CES flexible price. I think that would be an interesting thing. We could investigate this and then see whether really our Cobb-Douglas specification is superior. We didn't do that. And the last thing on human capital, that was the first question. Yeah, we didn't look in detail in different wage responses. I don't know whether we have this data. I think that would be the first way to go after this issue. Just seeing whether, top earners saw their wages decline more. I mean, our model right now tells the story that it's really these profits, and these profits are not related to particular skills. They're just pure rents from these monopoly profits. And this conforms with the data, but I guess it would be interesting to also look at data for wages in more detail. On capital destruction, Terry's first point, Germany versus France. Tim, you want to say something? Microphone.
Sorry. Yeah, the capital destruction is always uncertain. So different historians have come up for different estimates. We take like the most recent estimates. So these estimates for France and Germany are from like sort of the sources that Moritz is using for his paper, and from Piketty and Zuckman in a sense for France. But there's uncertainty about. This is why we don't use it in our baseline as a regressor. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'm sure that in the lunchtime, there will be room for more questions.
Should I hold it or?
No. It's like a. Sorry,
it's on the. Okay.
I think it should be.
So when I'm like 3 minutes before, so if I reach the 17th minute, let me know.
Yes, I will do something.
So that I put the final picture.
Perfect. I quickly introduce you. Okay, now we have our second paper by Massimo Morelli, Populism and War. And as the speaker before, you have 20 minutes. Thank you.
Very good. Thanks a lot for allowing me to present this paper. It's based in terms of the treatment of populism on a bunch of papers that I've been writing. Maybe the one I care the most about in terms of relationship with what I think is populism these days is the shift to commitment politics and populism that you can find on my website. In that framework that I'm using to explain populism, what matters for us for this research question is what are the types of policy commitments that are typical of a populist leader. And for Trump, we don't even have to guess, because we already know what commitments he was pushing in the first presidency, and we know a lot about his current campaign, including the final, the last statement he made in a Bloomberg interview that his favorite word in the dictionary is tariff. So there's a clear commitment to protectionism, as much as there is a clear commitment to disengagement in foreign affairs. So these are the two, let's say, most important commitments that belong to the international relations or foreign affairs. Then there are others, of course, that I discuss in other papers. And there are some things that are pretty obvious and people already know without a model, namely, of course, the disengagement of the Trump quote-unquote doctrine, if you can use that word for him, will have a direct effect on the Russia-Ukraine war. And that is pretty obvious. We don't need to talk about it with models. But what we are interested in, especially in a conference on geopolitical changes overall, so global changes, it could be interesting to see whether the shock that could be given by the election of Donald Trump will have big consequences also for civil wars in developing countries and for all type of interstate relations that do not include the superpowers. So is there a big spillover of a political change in a superpower, or what happens in other countries, even small, and in the relationship between countries and within countries globally, okay? So how do I plan what do I plan to show you? First, within civil wars, the basic idea is that something like, so the combination of protectionism and disengagement can be shown to induce the governments to reduce the share of the surplus that goes to the opposition groups. And therefore, because this happens all the time, this reduction of the share of the surplus going to the opposition groups generates either inequality or war, okay? In the sense that if the opposition group accepts the revised share, there is going to be higher inequality. If they reject, there is going to be war. So it's a very simple observation that is kind of unescapable. And then, of course, at the interstate level, we have a little bit less to offer in the sense that the intuition of the reduction of opportunity costs when there are less gains from trade is well known in liberal theory, but we have to add something about the symmetry versus asymmetric cases that can be treated differently. So as I said, the intuition, this should be the slide on the intuition. The intuition for the civil war result is the following. So there is a reduction in the divisible surplus, perhaps due to the Trump tariff or the consequent trade war and spillovers of that. And with this in mind, if the government is able to revise the share of the surplus going to the various groups, it will have the temptation to reduce the share of the opposition groups, given that the opposition groups in expectation will change their probability of conflict non-linearly, whereas the share goes down linearly, so there is an advantage. And so they always do that, and this increases the probability of war or conflict. So that's the intuition. As I said, as a summary of the interstate relations, most of the things that the model we show here suggest are in line with liberal theory, but there is an emphasis that I didn't see elsewhere, perhaps there is somewhere, on the fact that the countries that are more likely to change their hawkish behavior at the interstate level as a spillover of the change in the superpower are those that are actually more aggressive or more hawkish to begin with, and they are both militarily stronger and more open in terms of trade. So this kind of look at the heterogeneity is a simple addition. Okay, so here's the model. As I said, imagine that there is a country with a government group G and a opposition group R, and there is some divisible surplus W, and the offer is a share X of this surplus that G makes to R. And at the time in which this offer is made, the government is uncertain about what are the costs of war for R, and therefore it's the standard bargaining with asymmetric information like Jim Fearon. And then the opposition group realizes what her own cost of war is, and accepts or rejects the offer. Very simple. And the payoffs now are, so if you go to, if there is war, then for the opposition group, there is a probability lambda of winning, and this probability lambda multiplies psi W, because W, as also you have seen in the previous paper, the surplus that they are fighting about gets to be shrunk by a parameter. So only psi percentage of the original divisible surplus is going to be captured by the winner. And then there is minus cost, also the linear component. Also because in a parallel work that we are doing on the history of costs of war, actually, we see that costs that enter linearly are actually having a very different effect from costs that enter multiplicatively. And usually in models, these things are not treated the same. They are not treated together. They put either one or the other. Okay, so basically, the story is simple. Expected utility of war compared with expected utility of peace. For the opposition group, expected utility of peace is the offered X share of W. Expected utility of war is what I told you. You equate them to find what is the cost threshold below which you attack and above which you don't. And from this, you derive, therefore, a formula, very simple, for the probability of conflict, which is what we are interested in when we are trying to evaluate what the impact of a change in W, for example, or a change in lambda, or a change in any of these parameters has on the risk of war. Okay? So in order to get at the result, first of all, we have to think about what is that the government maximizes when choosing the share to be revised for the opposition group. Is this the slide with the optimization problem? Okay. So as you can see, very simple, you have that X enters in 3 places in the expected utility maximization problem for the government, because with probability P of X, there is going to be war, and then in that case you put the expected utility of war in that context, and then with probability 1 minus Px, so that there is no war, there is 1 minus X times W. So X enters in 3 places, and overall this, I don't show the first order condition, but overall this brings us to an X star that is always increasing in W. So if W shrinks, it is always the case in this model that the share to the opposition group is reduced. Therefore, the opposition group finds themselves with a peaceful payoff that is lower both because the cake has shrunk and because the share offered by the government is lower, and therefore it's kind of intuitive that the probability of conflict will go up, but it was not obvious that there would be even no condition for it. Okay? So here's the risk factor. Once you plug that X star into the probability of conflict function, you see that the probability of conflict basically is also always of the same sign. So when W shrinks, the probability of war goes up. And this is interesting because actually there is a long literature on the fact that maybe in some cases it's actually windfalls that create the greed factor that creates wars. Here, if there is a shrinking, why is it? Because we are saying we are in a context in which the government can revise the share going to the opposition group. So this is more likely to happen, for example, in countries where there is an authoritarian government, or where in any case the executive is particularly strong and can change the rules or the sharing anytime, whereas in a more complicated system of checks and balances, that's one potentially new route to understand the importance of democracy, not only for the democratic peace outcome interstate, but also within countries, because the availability of an institutional setup that is pretty stable and that doesn't depend on the decisions of the executive to constantly revise the sharing, offers a situation where, in fact, a poverty shock or a protectionism shock does not lead to war as much as it does when the government has that opportunity. So this, for political economy, is a potentially interesting observation. So proposition 1 tells us that just the protectionism shock, so if W goes down, is responsible in this model of a negative outlook on the risk of war. And moreover, if you add to the picture that part of the commitments of this potential populist government in the superpower is disengagement, well, where there is usually strategic disengagement, namely the US will disengage from all the conflicts and all the cases of support that they give, where the support that they give is not in the interest of America, is not consistent with America first. And so typically or statistically, most likely, is, whatever the adverb you want, is going to withdraw from the support of opposition groups that in any case have a lower probability of winning with respect to the government, and the support of them is based on other things other than the interest of America. So basically you can take it as, roughly speaking in the model, as a reduction of lambda, a reduction of the strength of the opposition groups that now do not receive the support of the United States, and that reduction in lambda has an additional effect on the increase of inequality. So basically the overall picture is that for sure overall inequality within countries and also across countries, that's easy to show, goes up, and there is this risk of civil wars whenever, in countries especially where the share of the surplus can be more flexibly decided by the governments. Okay? So now this is the interstate part. Yes. So now consider the spillovers of Trump's election for any pair of smaller countries, neighbors with whatever disputes in Asia or Africa, whatever. You pick your preferred ones, and let's see in a simple way, because we are not sophisticated trade economists, what's going to happen. So in peace, each divisible surplus of each country is composed by the domestic product. Then there is the gains from trade from the bilateral trading with the other country that is part of the dispute, and then each one of them has a reduced form plus alpha I T, where T is basically the total revenues available from global trade, and alpha I is the share of global trade that comes to that country in peace. And so that's kind of capturing the multilateral openness a la Martin Meyer turning in a very reduced form. If they go to war instead, well, they're gonna, you're gonna see the formula in a second. Yes, so if they go to war, there are some important assumptions that we make here on the technology. So, because in a model in which they simultaneously choose between attacking and not attacking, typically various authors have put some different forms of first strike advantage, sometimes on the probabilities of winning, sometimes on the cost. The easier one to make our point is to make it on the cost. So we suppose that the probability of winning is given by the relative military strength of the two countries, so it's a fixed lambda I or lambda ij, if you want, for I against j, and then you have the costs, which instead are much lower in general in case the country is the first striker, and much higher for the country that has been attacked. And this, I think, is something about which we could find evidence. I believe it's correct, but I haven't checked. And so the assumption here is that the cost for the attacker are from a uniform distribution, so we just need one variable with uncertainty in order to create the usual probability of war final statement. And the other one, we fixed it. So in principle, we could put uncertainty on both, but it doesn't matter. Okay? So what happens in equilibrium? Well, the equilibrium is simple because it's a simultaneous move game in which we want to select the best equilibrium. So if the costs are above the threshold of indifference between the expected utility of war and expected utility of peace, then if they are both with cost above such threshold, then if we can assume that they can coordinate, or the institutions can coordinate them to focus on the best equilibrium where they don't attack each other, they do something else. But as long as one of them has a cost that is below the threshold C hat I, there is war. Therefore, the probability of war is 1 minus C hat over C bar times 1 minus that C hat of C bar to the other country. That is the residual, we need basically both to be above C hat in order to have peace, whereas it takes just one of them to be below C hat to actually have war. So with this simplification, therefore, you have that the parameters of aggressiveness are captured by the C hat, and C hat depends on the military strength, but also on the global trade components of the WIs and on the destruction of the destructiveness of the conflict. Okay? 2 minutes left. 2 minutes, very good. So with all this in mind, we get, so this is the result thing, or no?
This is other implications.
Okay, no, so this is the result thing. Okay, so the main result, as I said, is, well, both a reduction in global trade and a reduction in domestic product for whatever other reason generate more conflict risks, and in particular when the country most affected by the reduction in global trades or gains from trade in general is the one that is militarily stronger and is actually more open. That's where you have the maximum increase in the risk of war. So I will skip the other things and I'll go to the predictions. So the predictions for the civil war.
We still at other implications. If you press, now we have predictions.
Okay, very good. So the prediction from the civil war come from a simple observation that are consistent with some other papers I had, namely, if I take the sort of necessary condition for a group to be potentially frustrated enough or aggrieved enough to start the conflict, namely being mismatched with respect to the government in terms of relative political, economic power with respect to military power, etc., etc. There is data on that we have in an economic policy paper. Combine it with the data about which countries have a share of surplus, divisible surplus that coming from trade and therefore coming from exports that will be reduced by the populism of Trump, etc., you get this final picture. You get this final picture that, for example, for Africa, the countries that will have a shock in terms of the overall probability, overall risk of war include the DRC, Mali, Iraq, so countries that we know are plagued by risk of war in any case. But there is also like a simple, red alarm clock, or like we are in an orange zone, so to speak, for also countries that are not typically viewed as countries that are at risk of war, at least so frequently, like Ghana, Botswana. These are countries that are actually doing quite well in terms of GDP. And so if one looks only at those macro measures, you wouldn't put countries like Botswana and Ghana in countries that are at risk of war. But unfortunately, the logic of our paper makes us predict that if Trump is elected, even countries of that type would be at greater risk. Therefore, don't vote for Trump. I'm done.
Now we have the discussant. Michael, you can sit in the middle if you like. And you'll have 10 minutes, please. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'll try to do the discussion sitting. It's a new thing for me. I typically move a lot, so... Okay, let's see if this works. Fantastic. All right, so thanks for the opportunity of discussing this paper. It's always a pleasure to read Massimo's papers. So I'll be discussing this paper that is focused on populism and the effect of populism on various types of war. So I guess, this question, as it stands, it can be addressed in many ways. So the first thing is to wonder what the authors focused on when they think about populism, and they highlight two factors that are, of course, motivated by Trump, which is protectionism and disengagement from foreign affairs. For my discussion, just like Massimo did in his presentation, I will focus on the protectionism part, which is the most, I think, interesting approach. So, first of all, when we think about protectionism and wars, the first obvious question is war among whom? And the very interesting spin that this paper takes is to focus on how protectionism in country A affects the risk of war in other countries. So, first of all, civil wars in other countries. And this is a natural question after someone asks it, because, of course, there is a connection between the risk of civil war and the negative income shocks. And protectionism in a particular country is likely to produce a negative income shock in other countries, and therefore, there is a natural link between protectionism and the risk of civil war that the authors formalize in their paper. And the logic is, as Massimo explained, simply that negative income shocks make the government less willing to buy off the rebels. So essentially, it's willing to give a smaller share of the pie, which leads to either more inequality or conflict. The second part of the paper, which I liked more, so I'll be a bit less pleasant on the civil wars part, is about interstate wars. And here, it's even less obvious, the link between populism and interstate wars. And again, here, the focus is on how protectionism in country A, the United States, will affect the probability of war between country B and C, so countries somewhere else in the globe. And, there is a reason that I will explain and that Massimo explained of why the prediction is that probability of war increases, but the analysis is much more nuanced, and indeed it can actually also decrease depending on the type of shock we consider. So the logic is, again, just like for civil war, that protectionism in country A causes a negative income shock in B and or country C. So other countries are affected negatively by protectionism, potentially in different ways, and this can have different effects on the risk of a war between B and C. And this can be understood with this simple intuition, that is that if think of one country of the dyad we are considering, country B, whose income goes down, well, B becomes more likely to attack its neighbors, but it is also less likely to be attacked by its neighbors. So this is where the nuance comes in, and of course the two countries are making the decision simultaneously, and the reason why overall we expect the probability of war to increase with a populism shock is because if the two countries are identical and the shock is the same, then these two factors do not cancel out. They increase the probability of war, of an interstate war. So there is a reason to expect that the interstate wars will increase. But in principle, if we think that protectionism affects countries differently, we have a very nuanced picture that the model can handle very, very, very easily, elegantly, I would say. And finally, there is the third part of the paper showing the empirical predictions. This is, I think, this speaks to the, let's say, simplicity of the theory, because in the theory, essentially, every parameter can be very, very easily mapped to observables, leading to very easily visible empirical predictions that can be just plotted on a map, as the one that Massimo showed. Okay, so this is the summary. I guess my comments will follow a little bit the structure, so that I'll start from the civil wars, and then discuss interstate wars and part of also the empirical predictions. But as tradition, let me also say some positive of the paper. Of course, the paper asks a very relevant applied question, which is new in the literature, and again, is one of those papers that once this question is asked, then it becomes a very natural question. But this question was never asked before, in my understanding. And the authors address this question with a very simple and tractable model. You can address a lot of heterogeneity among countries, a lot of different effects in this model if you wanted to. And this speaks to the simplicity and the tractability of it. And also the analysis is very transparent because there are very clear and separate parameters that you can move and you can interpret. So it's a very tractable model to think about this question. And again, the parameters can be easily mapped to observables and indeed prediction, which is not always the case with theory. So that's another aspect that I think is very good. And finally, the analysis of interstate wars highlights a nuance that Massimo explained, which is that since there are two actors involved, what matters is also their starting conditions. So if there are asymmetries or if there's the same, and who gets shocked is going to have completely different predictions on the probability of war. And I think this is something that they should absolutely push in the future. All right, so let me start from comment number 1, civil wars. So let me start from the context that, well, of course, the question on whether negative income shocks increase the risk of civil wars is a very old question, right? And there is a very big literature, empirical and theoretical, addressing this question. And I guess the main contribution of the authors is understand to recast the question of populism and civil wars into this well-known, fact and theoretical also literature. Well, the authors propose a new mechanism, a particular model that is different from the ones that I knew. However, it's unclear whether this whether the paper benefits from this model, because eventually the mechanism that the model proposes is not particularly robust in a sense that I will explain in a moment, nor novel. So let me again go over the equations. I just need to show you a few equations. So the idea again is that the government G offers a share of total wealth W to appease a rebel group. And there are peace payoffs, which are simply that the government, whatever it doesn't give to the rebel group, enjoys as consumption, and the rebel group enjoys as consumption whatever the government gives it. And then there are the conflict payoffs, which have the characteristic, as Massimo said, that there is a component that is multiplicative and the cost that is instead additive. And this is very important and for the main results, because this leads to the implication that when there is a negative shock, then there is a higher risk of civil wars. In fact, if you change the cost function and assumed that it enters multiplicatively, which is typically in the literature, there is the assumption that when you have to fight a war, you have to mobilize people, and there is an opportunity cost that is based on their productivity. So this is a typical assumption. Then you would find that W does not affect the risk of civil war. So this is, in this sense, it's not very robust because it depends on a very specific assumption of the model, and it's also something that people have discussed in the literature, and there are indeed theories that go beyond this and show the link between economic shocks and civil wars, as you would expect, but in a more robust and robust way. So instead about interstate wars, I think here the message is very clear in the paper and very interesting and nuanced. However, something that Massimo's presentation did not really go into detail about is that we didn't really see, like it's not particularly clear in the paper how the authors think of a populism shock in the interstate domain. So again, remember the payoffs of the two interstate potential conflict actors. It depends on 3 items, essentially: their income, their bilateral trade, and their trade with the rest of the world. world. And essentially, I think the interpretation that they give to the populism shock is that it affects trade with the rest of the world, whereas it would be also interesting to think about how it affects trade with the United States rather than the rest of the world, and think about also interaction between bilateral trade and multilateral trade, which is something that would probably change and create more nuances to this analysis. So another comment is about populism assumed as a negative economic shocks on other countries. Well, again, as I was saying, a more nuanced view of populism can lead to more interesting results, I think. So populist protectionism can target specific sector affecting different countries or ethnic groups differently. Again, populists often discuss, especially Trump, about they attack multilateral institutions. So one could think that populism will be a shock to the multilateral trade, but not bilateral trade, which again would affect and change the analysis of interstate. And finally, there is the idea that populism, in particular protectionism, is often aimed to China, so to rivals. And this will also create winners and losers among other countries, so even more nuances, because income shock would be asymmetric, which the model could easily handle. Finally, just since I'm running out of time, the empirical predictions, I think, are much more interesting if they were developed for what concerns interstate wars, because there are much more nuances that could be studied, and these asymmetries are hard to keep track. And I think that the model could simply provide a very nice heat map of countries that are expected to become more or less aggressive with protectionism shock. So in conclusion, this was a very relevant, urgent, yet non-obvious question to address, and the approach was clear and taught me a lot. I think the analysis of interstate wars was particularly promising, and I would encourage the authors to take a more nuanced definition of populism to enrich the paper's predictions, and derive the empirical predictions for the interstate case. Thank you very much.
Yes.
So I disagree. I think the potential of the interstate part of the paper, in terms of potential extensions and nuances, etc., I agree that could be larger and it's newer. But actually, the civil war part has one implication that, in fact, can be developed in a very, very interesting way. Because right now, it's completely true what Michael said, namely, basically, protectionism is just similar to whatever other negative income shock, and so we are treating the effect of protectionism on the risk of civil war in a country, but we could call it negative income shocks for some other reason. And so in a sense, it's true that as it is novel, not that novel, nor particularly unique to populism. So I completely agree. But what I disagree with is the issue of the costs. So I think that it is actually quite important that in the literature, the theoretical literature, they haven't noticed something quite important. Namely, if you only include one type of cost, either the linear minus C or the multiplicative psi, etc., you get something completely different from when you include both. And in reality, there are costs in terms of how many soldiers die, but also costs of the type how much the capital, like in the previous paper, gets shrinked, or how much whatever the objective of the war is reduced by the war itself. And what is interesting is that one could conduct an empirical investigation of the following type. Suppose I could categorize from historical data which civil conflicts have a cost that is particularly of the soldiers type versus those that are particularly of the capital stock type, or whatever. So I could divide them into those that have high psi, low psi, or high C, low C, etc. Then I could actually use the fact that Michael said is non-robust. Namely, I could use that. I know exactly under what set of circumstances a reduction in W gives me more work, and I know the cases in which a reduction on W gives me less work. So I could actually study now that I know all this, how the structure of costs impact on the effects of business cycle on conflict onset. I could actually derive almost like a structural model, to actually see whether indeed one can conclude a very nuanced thing. That is, it's not true that windfalls always cause war, and it's not true that poverty shocks always cause wars. It depends on the cost structure and the technology, and overall, if you know something about the cost structure, how it changes over time and across places, then you can get a very nuanced future work on the relationship between business cycle and conflict. So I do think that maybe this paper will be rejected, but the next one will be good.
Amazing. Are there questions? And if so, please introduce yourself with your name. Yes.
Yes, thank you very much. Bettina Rüttloff. I'm working here in Berlin at the German Institute of International and Security Affairs, which is a research institute financed by the Chancellor, however, not a supervised. So we are not a subdelegated body. My question would be exactly more on the political, let's say, conclusion, thinking about your interesting map of risks. And I know that political actors love these kind of mappings and the predictions. So I would like to provoke you maybe a bit on that by raising the question, what actually would be the political conclusion about your map? Would that mean, if we think of the underlying explanatory factor is more or less the income part, induced by populism. Would that mean as a reaction to focus on development aid, to focus on strengthening income, or just to raise awareness on fragility on certain countries? So what could a political actor do with your map? That's the
map certainly is meant to raise awareness that is not just GDP or standard measures that one should look at. And therefore, if you are, for example, responsible for the allocation of intelligence resources in different countries, either within the UN or even within a specific important country that wants to have intelligence monitoring across countries, in a sense, these maps tell you, okay, maybe at the margin, I should actually pay more attention about what is happening in Botswana or what will happen in Botswana, Ghana, South Africa, and Zambia, because they were not on my high list of risks, so maybe I did not even have some researchers that look at what happens, and now you should. So that's the idea. So politically, I don't know if I would use this word in this sense, because what I care about is the probability of peace. And when, for example, for another type of maps that I did with natural resources, I was approached by the Pentagon to help them draw these maps with real data. I refuse to do it because I don't want to be involved politically in this. But as an analyst, it's potentially very interesting. Also, in fact, McKinsey once contacted me for saying, but we could do a lot of consulting to companies that give us real money, because they will move from investing in one country that was considered safe to another one, because now you tell us that it's risky. Okay, you do it. I'm not involved in this.
Thank you, Massimo. Moritz, Schularick, Kiel Institute and Sciences Po. I want to tease you a little bit on giving us your thoughts on the protectionism shock coming from populism. If it regards the hegemon in the US, and you motivated us with the US, is more than just an income shock, right? It's like a globalization shock. It's everything that trade costs, enforcement, everything that comes with that. And I was wondering whether, if it's a globalization shock to some extent, whether the reverse of Thierry's papier with Philippe and Matthias doesn't apply, that, you know, sort of the multilateral dimension, multilateral trade gets reduced, so the bilateral gets more important again, which then in their logic would reduce conflict risk. So you have these two forces, you have the income shock, but you also have the multilateral trade cost shock, or however you want to, the globalization shock. And, you know, could you explore that more, and maybe they work in opposite directions?
Yes, right now, with the version we have now of the model, we are in sharp contrast with Martin, Meyer, and Tönning, because in a sense, the payoffs that come from trade, you can divide them as those that come from the bilateral component and those that come from your share of global trade revenues, and they're additively separable. And basically, when you go to war, you shut down the bilateral trades. So obviously, if the bilateral trades are important, it's a big opportunity cost factor, and in that sense, we are in line with them. But here in our additive model, there is no. They have a network, so their model is richer. But at least, you know, our simple mind doesn't agree with the fact that when multilateral trade goes down, you have necessarily a greater emphasis on the bilateral dependence, because they are additively separate. It's not that the one goes into the other. So right now there is a contrast. But however, as you are hinting, and also Michael, this is really a toy model, right? So presumably I can do more to engage more into that comparison, and there will be some more nuanced things than just saying, well, I don't agree with them. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Our time is up, unfortunately, but I'm sure Massimo will be open for more questions in the lunch break.
Sure.
This is where we are heading now, the lunch break, which goes until 1:40 until we meet again for the paper session 3. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Massimo. So great you could make it. So there was some back and forth.